very much. Thank you for those really gracious words, and thank you to Mary Ortiz for her excellent leadership, and all of you for turning out tonight. I hope you've had a little bit of wine. If you need a little bit more, please put your hand up, and my son Carlos will come find you in the fall. It's really something that I'm looking forward to very much, just have this opportunity to give this lecture tonight about music and about life. This is not something that I typically do. Now, to be sure, I do a lot of public speaking. I'm the president of a think tank here in Washington, D.C., which anymore actually doesn't require that much thinking in tanks. What I do is travel around and do a lot of fundraising, but I do about 175 speeches a year. And the public speaking that I do is ordinarily not about classical music, it's about policy and politics. One of the things when you do a lot of public speaking, there's a rule of thumb, which is never give a speech for the first time. That doesn't make sense, I realize. You have to sooner or later. But really what that means is never do it in front of an audience you care about, and make sure you don't have too many speeches in your rotation. So I'm breaking all the rules tonight. I'm talking for the very first time about this topic. Let's see how it goes. This starts with a word of thanks, by the way, to Jonathan, who's up in the balcony here. He's working AV, and this is an AV heavy talk. So it's basically me and Jonathan tonight working in tandem. And if we have a crisis, we're going to work it out together. And I have to say thank you. We're going to watch a lot of music tonight. We're going to watch a whole bunch of clips from different composers. I'm not going to say who are the greatest composers, but I'm going to give you some of the greatest composers that taught me the most important things that I learned as an adult. Okay, so that's basically the criteria and the ground rules. And I'm going to start right in with something I want you to watch. We're going to start with a composer, and I'm going to tell you why we're looking at it here in a second. But first of all, I'm going to tell you this is a piece by Dmitri Shostakovich. This is the last movement of his 6th symphony, written in 1939. Now, Dmitri Shostakovich was the greatest of the Russian Soviet composers, much favored sometimes by the regime of Joseph Stalin. He was sort of in and out of favor. Sometimes he was thought to be decadent, and sometimes he was thought to be a great composer. Finally, at the end of his career, he was the head of the Composers Union. Yeah, they had a Composers Union, which sounds like a great idea, I realize. Shostakovich wrote 15 beautiful symphonies. This is 1 minute opening the last movement of the 6th symphony. So 60 seconds of Shostakovich, and I'll come right back to you. It starts Palace of Music in Barcelona. And here you've got a little taste of it. You probably have an idea why I'm showing you this particular orchestra, and now I'm going to bring it Behold the hair. See, this is evidence of a once great civilization. Why do I put this up? Well, because this is basically what I want to talk about tonight. Not that I played in the orchestra, and you're not going to see any more of me tonight, but I do want to tell you that over those years, I learned what I believe are some of the most important lessons in my life that I take forward. Now, a lot has happened. I'll give you just a little bit of background that took me to here. When I was a little kid, all I wanted to be was a French horn player. I marginalized everything. I didn't do my homework. I took the minimum number of classes. I graduated from high school by the skin of my teeth, and I went to a conservatory in California and didn't make it through my first year. I dropped out, kicked out. split here. And I went on the road as a professional musician because that's really what I always wanted to do. And I played chamber music all over the United States, and I played for a couple of years with a jazz guitar player named Charlie Bird. And then I wound up in Barcelona, playing in the orchestra here. And a little bit later tonight, I'm going to tell you why I ended up in Barcelona. And the reason is not, to give you a clue, to play in that orchestra. It's actually something else that was an important life lesson, but I'm going to get ahead of myself. So that's how I wound up doing that. Now, a little bit later, things changed. I went back to college and graduated when I was 30, and then went and got a PhD and became a college professor, and then wound up running a think tank, and 1,000 flowers bloom. Life's great, right? But all the important stuff that I learned that was imprinted on me, I believe, came from this time. And I'm going to tell you the big 4 lessons that I learned that have stayed with me, and I offer them to you with humility and with a spirit of Catholic brother and sister faith. Here they are. I learned the meaning of work. The real meaning, not how to be a hard worker, that's important, but the meaning of work really is, the why of work. The second was recognizing the importance of suffering. I learned this from truly the greatest composers. The third is how to understand, how to cultivate myself an appreciation for things that I didn't like, new things, things that were foreign. I'm going to explain all these things a little bit later. And finally, I learned, believe it or not, when I was a musician, prudence. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm going to get there tonight. I offer these up to you, and I look forward to hearing from you because we're going to have some time for discussion afterwards, if you'd like. Okay, so let's start. Let's start with finding meaning in work. We live in Washington, D.C., and this is the most professionalized place in the world. They say, St. Thomas Aquinas used to say that there are 4 substitutes for God: money, power, pleasure, and fame. Right? And these are substitutes for God because they look so good, but they take you in the wrong direction away from God. And every city, every place has its favorite substitute for God. New York, it's money. You go to any place, everybody talks about money all the time. How much does your apartment cost? How's your fund doing? Right? If you go to LA, it's all about fame. Who knows who? Fame. Here, power. Everybody talks about what do you do, and they want to know how proximate you are to the sources of power. It's actually obnoxious. And that's something you don't like it, and I'm sure all of you have seen it, right? What do you do? Nobody ever asks you here, why do you do what you do? Why do you do it, right? If they did, what would you say? What would your immediate answer be? What's the why of your work? I believe we need to have an answer. Work is the source of dignity. Work organizes our lives in a sense of vocation, whether it's paid work or work with family. What's the why of your work? Here's how I learned to answer that question. When I was in Barcelona, I had a favorite composer. And it was, if you were paying attention to the beautiful viola when we came in today, she was playing unaccompanied cello suites by Johann Sebastian Bach. Okay, transcribed for viola. Viola, arguably just as beautiful, maybe more so than on the cello. And Bach was, in fact, my favorite composer. Everybody knows him knows anything about classical music. And if you don't know anything about classical music, you know a lot of his music because it's in your head, you've heard it, it's in your ears. Okay, now, Bach was an incredibly industrious and productive composer. He lived between 1685 and 1750, and in his 65 years, he published 1,000 works. Who knows how many works went unpublished? This is also how productive he was. He had 20 kids. He was like an oppressed dad. What was Bach's passion? Bach's passion, at the center of his life, was his Christian faith. Bach was arguably the most famous classical music Christian of all times. It's incredible. When you look at his works, most of his works were actually set to religious themes. So we're going to listen to one. As a matter of fact, I'm going to stop right now, and I want to listen to one right now that maybe some of you heard. This is the chorale from his setting of St. Matthew's Passion. This was written in 1727 when he was the cantor in the Thomaskirche in Leipzig. It's a piece that many of you know. If you don't, you're going to want to go home and listen to the whole thing. 60 seconds of the great Johann Sebastian Bach. Working for the Thomas Kirche in Leipzig, virtually all of his music is cantatas. There's hundreds of cantatas were written for every Sunday in the church year. So most of it was biblical, of course. But he had a lot of secular works that he wrote as well, as commissions and as works for his children. His 20 kids were all musicians. He had to have some sort of etudes and studies for them to play. At the end of every one of his scores, he wrote, Soli Deo Gloria, glory to God alone. When I saw that, I thought to myself, would I ever write that at the end of my work, whatever my work happens to be? Now, Bach was not famous like he is today in his time. In fact, he was known as a good teacher, but he was not esteemed as a beautiful composer until 100 years after he died. He was just a pedestrian church composer in his time. But 100 years after he died, another famous composer in Germany, Felix Mendelssohn, happened across his works and started experimenting with the scores, invited over all his friends. Felix Mendelssohn was a big star. He says, you think my stuff is great? Wait till you hear this. This guy died 100 years ago. And Bach got famous and has never lost his luster. So Bach labored to support his family in relative obscurity, which seems crazy by today's standards. Still, there was a minor historian at the time that interviewed Bach before he died and asked him the question that I just posed to you. Why do you write music? Now, you could have said, how do you write music? What's your production process? Or what kind of music do you like to write? And furthermore, when he said, why do you write music? Bach could have said, because I have a lot of mouths to feed. Right? What did he say? Here's what Bach said, asked why do you write music. The aim and final end of all music is nothing less than the glorification of God and the enjoyment of man. To the glory of God alone. And for the service of others, which is the way that we show the glory of God alone. This was his automatic response. This is what came out of his mouth. And I said to myself, I want that to be my answer, no matter what I'm doing. But it wasn't my answer. Brooks, why are you a French horn player in the Barcelona Symphony? For the glory of God, the good of man. No. So I went in search of something where I could answer that question. Went in search of it. And you know where it led me? To economics. The dismal science. Impossible, isn't it? I don't know. The words of Bach actually have been echoed by many great saints. We talk about the fact that the vehicle is not specific. You don't glorify God and serve the enjoyment of your fellow men and women only through music. On the contrary, where do you find the ability to do those things? The great Saint Jose Maria Escrivá passionately loved the world. This is a famous speech in the late 1960s at the University of Navarre. Google it. Read the whole thing. God is calling you to serve Him in the ordinary material and secular activities of human life. He waits for us every day in the laboratory, in the operating theater, in the army barracks, in the university chair, in the factory, in the composer's studio. Understand this well. There's something holy, something divine, hidden in the most ordinary situations. We can do this no matter what we do. We can be like Bach no matter where we go. As an economist, I can be more like Bach than I was as a French horn player. Why did I become an economist? Because in my 30s, I recognized that there was a way to help the world. I came across a fundamental statistic that boggled my mind. And this was it. That since I was a child, the percentage of the world's population living in poverty had declined by 80%. And the reason for that was the American free enterprise system spreading around the world. That's why I became an advocate for free enterprise, and that's the reason I became an economist, because I want to be more like Bach. Strange, isn't it? Yet that's the truth. And each one of us has that. Lesson number one, no matter what I do, Bach teaches me to answer the two questions right. Am I glorifying God? Am I serving others? The answer is no, you're not doing it right. The answer is yes, get a good night's sleep and come ready to fight. Lesson number two, the importance of suffering. Nobody wants to suffer. But when you're in music and you know a lot of musicians and you're in the arts, you see a lot of suffering. You see a lot of people who should be enjoying their lives, but they're not enjoying their lives at all. I want to move on to another great composer, the greatest composer of the late Russian Romantic period, Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky. Here's something that he said shortly before his death. There are days, hours, weeks, and months in which everything looks flat, when I'm tormented by the thought that I'm forsaken, that no one cares for me. I mean, everybody loved him. What's he talking about? He wrote the Nutcracker Suite. He wrote Swan Lake. He wrote Eugene Onegin. He wrote some of the greatest symphonies ever written in the late Romantic period. His last 3 symphonies, 4, 5, and 6, they're masterworks. Nobody can touch this through the orchestration, through the brilliance of the composition, through the ideas. Tchaikovsky was amazing. He died at 53, just getting started. One of the things that we know, by the way, based on current studies, is that composers and artists tend to do their absolute best work when they're 60% of the way through their lives. And in an ordinary lifespan, that means you're doing your best work when you're 50. He was just getting warmed up. He could have gone for years and years. Yet this is what he really thought. And he was in the blackest of depressions most of the time. He was suicidal. He was protected by his friends from himself. He was miserable. He was misery incarnate. Well, when he was writing his 6th symphony, he was incredibly depressed. He was writing to his nephew, Vladimir Davidov, whom he really loved a lot, who loved him. And he said, I've written dozens of drafts of my 6th symphony, and I keep tearing them up and throwing them away. Hear that? I'll take any of them, right? I would be so proud to have written any of the stuff that he threw in the trash can, right? Dozens of drafts in his depression. Hate it, throw it away, over and over and over again. Finally, he finished the piece. I want to show you now the first 60 seconds of the last movement of his 6th symphony. This is the Pathetique Symphony. Again, if you like it, go home and listen to the whole thing. This is better altogether. 4th movement, 6th symphony. By the way, what year was this written? He lived from 1840 to 1893. This was written, not coincidentally, in 1893. Beloved by all, standing ovations. He died 9 days later. His friends looked at this, they read the notes and the score. They noticed a couple things. This was based on the Orthodox Requiem of Death. The last instruction to the conductor is morendo, dying away. This was a suicide note. He drank cholera water 4 days after his premiere and died 5 days after that. Now, somebody of his stature would not have done this. It was impossible. Cholera was known to be a disease of the poor. And there was a major cholera epidemic that was wiping out entire ghettos in Moscow and St. Petersburg at the time. Tchaikovsky would not have died of cholera had he not exposed himself to it voluntarily. Now, this is still a controversial theory, to be sure, but it all fits, given the suffering that he was under. Maybe, maybe not. But many composers do great composer of the early Romantic period, was so manic depressive that his black depression was incapacitated, couldn't write anything. During his manic periods, he couldn't stop writing. He was in a manic period when he married his beloved wife, Clara Schumann. And to celebrate the wedding, as a gift to his wife, he wrote 600 songs. Like, I bet she thought that was just great and awesome. It's like, what are you doing in there? Writing your wedding gift. I mean, there are lots of cases of this kind of mood disorder, this mental illness, and this suffering in the community of artists. Most studies find that artists and writers are at least 100% more likely to suffer from depression than the general population. What is that all about? And by the way, it's not just the great artists, it's also the great saints. If you were watching the news four weekends ago, you got just a tiny bit of relief in the headlines from the ghastly election process that we're going through right now. Why? Because of this. Because the great Saint Mother Teresa of Calcutta was canonized, right? But here's what maybe you don't know about Saint Teresa. After her letters to and from her spiritual director were published posthumously in 1992, against her will, by the way, burn your correspondence. Here's what we learned. This is what it was like for St. Teresa for the last 50 years of her life. There's so much contradiction in my soul. Heaven holds nothing for me, nothing but emptiness. I don't believe that God loves me. I've had no experience of my Savior. 50 years of blackness, of darkness. This is St. Teresa. Who did more? Who was the most popular? Who was the most impactful Catholic of the 20th century? St. Teresa of Calcutta. This was what was written on her heart from the age of 30 until she died. You never know. You never know. Now, most of us don't suffer like this, but most of us do suffer. Is there any purpose in this? When you talk to the people who do suffer a lot, particularly people in the arts community, writers, composers, poets, there's a one weird thing they all say. They don't want to be depressed. They don't want to feel this way. They don't want to be in a state of despair. But you know what they all say? They need it. I've heard it 100 times. I've heard it from my own mother. My mother was depressed, clinically depressed, psychotically depressed from the time she was a teenager. She was also an artist of some renown in Seattle, Washington. And she would say it again and again. I actually need it. How is that possible? It doesn't make sense. Maybe it's just rhetoric. You know, they hate it, but literally depend on it and can't quite say how. Social psychologists started to look into this question in the 1970s. Why is it that artists seem to be dependent on their own depression? And what did they find? They found something that they call depressive realism, unusual insight that comes from suffering. And in other words, we can have a theory of this, and there's a lot of theology on the subject, but when social psychologists using natural experiments find evidence of this, it makes it seem a little different, doesn't it? The depressive realism effect was ascertained in experimentation using human subjects, in which people were asked to perform acts of skill, just tasks, minor tasks of skill, and then to assess their own prowess afterward. How accurate are they in saying how well they did in the task they just did? The more depressed you are, the more accurate you are in seeing insightfully the truth of your own ability. They find again and again, it's called the sadder but wiser effect too, by the way. The sadder you are, the more melancholy you suffer, the more likely you are to have unusual insight. That's what Tchaikovsky was feeling. This is what my mother was depending on in this strange way. This was the productivity of suffering. You don't want it, but you need it. Psychologists believe that it stimulates self-reflective thought. There's a wonderful paper, academic paper I read. It's a fancy economics journal called Review of Economics and Statistics. Brand new, just being published. This is the article this month. It's from a professor in Danish University who's looking at the correspondence of three great composers, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Ludwig van Beethoven, and Franz Liszt. He chose these composers because they had voluminous amounts of letters, correspondence going all the time. They wrote thousands of letters, and they're all preserved, and they're in an archive. We also know about the corpus of their work. And so what this economist was doing a content analysis of the letters to see the correspondence between their sadness and their productivity. Using really good content analysis tools and the right statistics, he found causally that it sounds more precise than it really is. A 37% increase in the sadness of a composer is responsible for one seminal major composition, one of the great compositions in their lives. The bump in sadness results afterward in the creative insight that leads to their best work. We're understanding this better, but here's the takeaway. I'm not giving advice here, but I'm understanding myself a little bit better. And I understand this a little bit better as well. I used to read this, St. Paul's second letter to the Colossians, and it sounded like happy talk. It sounded like, make the best of it. No, I rejoice in what I'm suffering. He meant that, and so should we. It's a gift, but we have to understand it as a gift. We have to work with it as a gift. Lesson number 2, we need to suffer. Now, so far, things have been pretty comfy in the music department. I've shown you music that is familiar, and if you at least haven't heard it, you're going to like it because it's extremely tonal and extremely Western. Well, you're not going to be comfortable anymore here for a second, because we're going to look at a great composer, but this is a composer that you haven't really heard before. And I'm going to sort of cultivate some openness. What I'm going to talk about now is how music, unfamiliar music, taught me to leave my zone of comfort and made me a more creative person, and why this is critically important. Classical sitarist. That's the Mozart of India. Strange, isn't it? But if you play this for anybody of Indian descent, this is one of the greatest sitarists, one of the greatest artists of, certainly considered to be of the last 100 years in India. I heard that for the first time when I was 18 years old. I was a senior in high school, and I said, what is that? I wanted to know more about that. I couldn't believe my ears. So I took the money that I was earning making pizzas and playing French horn gigs, and I found this record store, records in those days, students here, that's like a black, plastic thing that goes around, and music on it. And crazy, I know. And I found this world music record store, and everything I could find with this great Hindustani classical musician, and others just like him. And I was completely captivated by it. I wanted to learn more and more about it. And the funniest thing is, this is about 1982, it turns out the whole world knew about Ravi Shankar 10 years earlier, because the Beatles made him famous. George Harrison became a Hindu or something, and he took the Beatles to India, and they all, a bunch of hippies, and they met this guy, and he became really world famous, and I had no idea, because I didn't listen to any pop music at all. I was completely wrapped up in classical, so I thought I discovered this guy, which is sort of funny now in retrospect. But I loved it, and I wanted to know more about this. He lived from 1920 to 2012, and he's so revered still in India that the greatest guru, Hindu guru in India, renamed himself Sri Ravi Shankar in honor of this great and in fact spiritual Hindu musician, deeply religious guy. A little quote from him.
which sounds, I have to tell you, an awful lot like Bach. I try to get my music a spiritual quality, very deep in the soul, which does something even if you're not realizing it or analyzing it. That's the duty of music, is to transport you in a way that can bring you closer to God. That was Ravi Shankar's philosophy, and indeed that helped me a lot. Now, I'll say that my fascination with Indian music didn't always serve me well. In my abortive only year of college, I dropped my required classes to take North Indian drumming lessons. And don't do that. So, new things like this are kind of anathema to a lot of people. I got lucky because I was exposed to it when I was 18. Some of you listen to that, you think it's just, my parents would hear me listening to this, and they'd like, what's he doing? Is he smoking pot down there? It would be, no, I'm listening to great classical music. But yeah, right, what a bunch of noise, right? Conservative people don't like that stuff. They don't like new things. And it's interesting, because I'm a conservative person, politically and socially. But I got lucky because this was installed on my hard drive, and it was just being assembled a little bit. But I understand how this stuff is weird. There are wonderful studies that look at the difference between conservative people and liberal people and their ability to grasp these kinds of new things, particularly in the arts. I have these friends at New York University in the psychology department who do work looking at the differences in lifestyle between conservatives and liberals by looking at their offices. And it turns out that they can predict with almost 100% accuracy your politics and social views by looking at your office. Why? Because if you're conservative, you're tidy, you have sports memorabilia in your office, right? Your pencils are sharpened, right? If you're a liberal, on their hand, it looks like a dog's dinner on your desk, right? You're playing jazz in the background, and it's all kinds of weird world music stuff going on like this, right? So you'd actually think that I'm some sort of hippie based on this. But it does show, based on these studies, that in fact people are different. Now, why does it matter that those of us who, if you are like me, and you have conservative values, you have traditional values, and even if you have conservative politics, that you have openness to things that are outside your general zone of comfort like this. And I've told you that if you go to India, you'll find nobody who doesn't think that this is a great master, even though it sounds like something strange to us. Embracing that, having openness to that, why is it important? There's a psychiatrist in the psychiatry department at Washington University in St. Louis named Robert Cloninger. And he talks about the absolute best way for you to be happy and for you to age in a healthy way, and is to experience something new with which you're uncomfortable every day. That's basically it. Find something new that makes you, that's weird, every day. I'm not sure I like it every day. I think maybe it's even a little ugly, but I'm going to experience it nonetheless. This is therapy for all of us. Now, this stuff was so valuable for me in my creativity. It started this lifelong interest in Indian culture and Indian music. I visited India for the first time when I was 19. I was on a concert tour, and I went to India, and it was fascinating tromping around. I actually got marooned in the southern Indian city of Chennai and walked around slum for a couple of days, unsupervised entirely. It was amazing. I mean, the poverty was something I had never seen before. It was the middle of the worst socialism that was killing hundreds of millions of Indians. India's a much better country now, and I'll show you a little bit of that later. But it formulated a sense of wanting to know more, and it's lasted till this day. What I want to show you now is how this is manifest, how that early music, how it's affecting my work today. Now, I run a think tank, a public policy think tank. What do? We work with public officials, we do a lot of conferences, we write books and articles, and we talk about the proper role of government in society and the specifics of how to have a good tax code and all that stuff. Foreign policy, social policy, all that. But we're also working on some creative projects on the side. I'm going to tell you about one right now that bears on this. We're making a movie. We've been working on a movie for a year. It's a full-length cinematic documentary. And I'm the host of this movie. It's a really interesting experience. A lot of it is being shot in India. And I'm going to show you a 4-minute clip. This is brand new. Nobody's ever seen this before at all. This thing's going to come out in March. But this is a clip that takes place in Dharamsala, which is in the Himalayan foothills. This is where the Dalai Lama lives. It's where Dalai Lama is the single most respected religious leader in the world today. there. And this is a little 4-minute clip that gives you an idea of how Ravi Shankar is still affecting my thinking today. So 4 minutes.
This road is made for 1 1/4 cars. So the cars are coming up here around blind corners passing. These guys are professionals, but then you notice that there's a burned out hull of a car off the side all the way down to the bottom of the cliff. And then, yeah, it's good till it's not. We're on a windy road in the Himalayan foothills in India. We're going to Dharamsala, which is the home of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He's a warrior for human welfare. He's a believer in the potential and dignity of every single person.
The suspicion that people have about capitalism comes because they think people like me don't believe in morals and they don't believe in any regulation at all. That's not true.
I had this theory when I was a kid that you get to invent your whole life. You choose your vocation, you choose your faith, you choose it once. I thought about it and I read a lot and I had a mystical experience in the shrine of Guadalupe in Mexico when I was 15. And that was kind of revealed to me that I was Catholic. For the longest time I wondered, what if I never feel it? Then I realized, it doesn't matter. It's a question of your commitment to a constant search for truth, notwithstanding what you feel. If you're not willing to practice what you believe, well, you're never going to do anything, and you're never actually going to find any truth.
Everybody's looking for meaning in their work. I've been looking for the meaning in my work for years. Where do you find it? You can look at a book about economics. You can talk about GDP growth and tax rates and money, but let me tell you, the real meaning of what we do is found in the unexpected places.
I really appreciate you, your organization. No matter what name, capitalism, I don't like capitalism. but in terms of money matter, we have to make friendship with capitalism.
When you're building a movement, you have to look for the icons and language that's not associated with your movement. It's the only way to do it. You have to find people that people associate with the opposite point of view, or that they never thought about the context of what you're doing, because you want to disequilibrate people's prejudices. And that's what you got to do. And all movements have done that before. You don't just take my words because you respect me. This is what Lord Buddha said to his followers. The Dalai Lama follows this assiduously, so he wants to collaborate with people who think in a different way. Free enterprise is about compassion and justice at its best. So therefore, this is our stuff too.
We have to start by asking, what actually does lead each of us to lead the best life?
Everyone wants happy life, to know not suffering. Yet, without suffering, our own creation.
This place is filled with people who are looking for truth, and who are looking for happiness. And that's what I'm looking for too. That's what everybody's looking for.
Well, happiness is a funny thing. Happiness is not something you obtain.
Happiness for me is to provide happiness to other people.
To me, happiness is finding and seeing new things.
Being able to do what I need to do from my side.
अभी बच्चे लोग पढ़ने के आगे बढ़ जाएंगे तभी फिर कुछ हो जाएंगे.
Money cannot provide love. We need love.
Whether it's capitalism, socialism, or Buddhism, or any human activity, science, technology, or so long as it's a human activity, it must benefit human beings as a whole.
You are showing genuine interest, not only in money matter, but more wider perspective, ideal, relationship.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Each of us have the ability to dream something, change the world, not from top, from individual.
Out in March on Netflix. Who knows? An interesting aside on that. When I was filming that, and I've been to this Himalayan town a bunch of times, and when you're there, you see a lot of Westerners. You see a lot of people who look like me walking around this town. And when you talk to them, you know what they say? They say, we're seekers. We're seekers. And aren't we all just seekers? Not really. You know the Christian difference? We're sought. Luke 19:10, the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. And that's the big difference. You know, when you see that, and some of my colleagues see that, you say, you become a Buddhist? You say, no, it makes me more of a Catholic to actually have these experiences. And it's these outside experiences that make it possible for me to understand how dear, how precious, how wonderful that really was. How wonderful that is. That film will be called Abundance Without Attachment, by the way. Now, I'm going to keep going on this. When you're in Dharamsala, it's one thing. There's Indian music, it's something else. Let's get even a little bit less comfortable. I'm going to give you the music of Olivier Messiaen now. Now, Olivier Messiaen was one of the great composers of the 20th century, but he's an avant-garde composer. Now, what you're going to hear now is some chamber music, 60 seconds. It's going to feel like 10 minutes, but it's 60 seconds. And Messiaen, if you hear bird calls in here, it's because Messiaen, the composer, had a PhD in ornithology. But these were the most interesting things about it. 60 seconds of the great Olivier Messiaen. This is the quartet for the end of time.
here's the most interesting thing. Olivier Messiaen was a mystic. He completely dedicated his life to the Catholic Church. My faith is a grand drama of my life. I'm a believer, so I sing the words of God to those who have no faith. Now, maybe you're saying, he's not a very good missionary, right? But you want to know how he spent his life? You know how all the great 20th century composers of that generation, you know what they did to make money? They all came to Hollywood. Hollywood was full of former prisoners of war and refugees and Jews who'd run out of Western Europe, and they're all writing all that fancy movie music. What did Messiaen do? After the war, he stayed in France, and he was an organist at a local parish. Why? Because he wanted to spend all of his time with the body of Christ. All of his time. Not going to get that called one. Can you say that? Imagine that. That's that godless reprobate. I want to be more like that. I want to dedicate my life to the Master in that way. There's always something new. He blended imagination, intellect, and love for God. Here's his biographer, by the way. Messiaen's music is full of apocalyptic visions of last judgments, angels, the celestial banquet, the glorious body of our Savior, the colors of the celestial city. This piece, the Quartet for the End of Time, you know what that's based on? Revelation chapter 10. Here is the text upon which what you just heard is based. And I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. Not bad. Who knew? Expose yourself to new things, because you just never know what's there. Last. Live with prudence. Live with prudence. This doesn't sound like something you listen to in music, or you learn in the music business. If you know any musicians, you know they don't seem to be very prudent, do you? But this is really important. Now, I'm going to take you to a piece right now that I heard for the first time when I was a kid, and it boggled my mind. My mother, when she was painting, listened to a lot of classical music. She had a big record collection. My parents loved classical music. And they just cycled through them. They stacked the records up in those old record players that would go, and they would go in and playing. And here's a piece I heard over and over and over again. It completely captured my imagination. This is a piece written by Manuel de Falla, a southern Spanish composer. He was born in Cádiz in Spain, and he died in Argentina after the Spanish Civil War. He lived from 1876 to 1946. This is a piece called El Amor Brujo, which is also known as Love the Magician. It was written in 1914 and 1915. 60 seconds of El Amor Brujo, which captured my little 8-year-old brain, and still does today. Mid-century politics, I might add. A great conductor nonetheless. Manuel de Falla, here's what he looks like, by the way. We have to work for others simply without vain or arrogant intention. But I want to tell you about the piece that you just heard, Love the Magician. What's the message in Love the Magician? Go for it. Fall in love. You can't help yourself. Do it now, right? So imprudent, right? So incredibly imprudent that music worked like a worm into my brain. And the message did too, because so much music is based on this. It's about love, it's about passion, it's about living passionately and loving the world in a passionate way. Now, to the modern, ordinary ear, that sounds like the most imprudent thing that you could possibly do. But that's actually, in a way, it's not right. Lately, I've been reading a book that many of you have written by Joseph Pieper, the great Jesuit scholar, called The Four Cardinal Virtues. If you haven't read it, you gotta read it. You read a little bit every day, so it's like a bottle of vitamins. Don't take it all at once. But it's great. And the first chapter is on prudence. And I was dreading it, right? The prudence is my least favorite of cardinal virtues, right? I mean, it's timidity, it's holding back. It's just kind of living a life of just not engaging fully. I'm not prudent, it seemed to me. So Pieper says that's wrong, actually. That prudence is the willingness and ability to make the right decision. And there are two ways that you can sin against prudence. Number one is by being rash. The other is by dithering, is by not jumping in. I thought about this and I remembered something from Aquinas. The certitude of prudence cannot be so great as to remove all anxiety. You sin against prudence if you don't take risk. You sin against prudence if you don't have adventure. You sin against prudence if you're not a little afraid about what's in front of you. I ask myself, what do we do more of? Do we sin against prudence through rashness, which we always think, or do we sin against prudence by risk-averse behavior? So I went in search of the answer to that question, right? Thinking, is defy a right? Love the magician, jump in. Or do we need to be more prudent in the other way? So there's a study that I found. It's a wonderful study. I just read it a month ago. It's by Stephen Levitt. You know that name is because he's the author of Freakonomics, which has sold 4 million copies. He's an economics professor at University of Chicago. And he set up a study to ask people if they were willing to let a coin flip make their major life decisions. They set up a coin flip program on his computer, and they recruited 10,000 volunteers, all of whom had a major life decision they just couldn't make. Should I ask her to marry me? Should I quit my job? Should I get that trick knee fixed? That's the kind of stuff that they couldn't decide. Kind of a big decision they just couldn't decide. They said, fine. They committed to letting a coin flip make their decision. Now, what do they find? They found that the people, the heads that do it, tails that don't. For every single person in the study. If you got heads, you were going to be at least 10% happier than if you got tails. That's what they did. And what does that tell you? Think back to what I was just talking about. This was inducing people to break the sin of dithering, of timidity, as opposed to of the sin of rashness, right? And that's exactly what happened. People are too timid. People don't jump in. People don't do this right. They're not living, they're not fully alive. That's what that study tells us. That's what Defy tells us. That's what all the music is telling us. That's what's kind of been on my heart all these years. It started off with a little video of me going to Barcelona and playing in the orchestra. And why would I be in Barcelona? Because it's a great job. Paid good money. I was playing the best music in the world. When you're a musician, there aren't that many jobs, right? I mean, so you take a job. I'm looking at Mary because she's like, yeah, tell me about it. I mean, everybody's underemployed. It's tough to find a job. That's not what I was. When I was 24 years old, I was on a concert tour in France, playing chamber music. And I stepped out on stage. I just got there, really, really super jet lagged, and they were introducing my quintet, my brass quintet at the time. And I looked at the audience, and there was this girl, and she was smiling at me, which is weird, right? So I thought to myself, she's a beautiful girl. I gotta meet this girl afterwards. And mental load, after this thing is over, I'm gonna go talk to the girl. So I go and I talk to the girl, and introduce myself, not a word of English, nothing. Couldn't communicate at all. And we tried to have this conversation, and I saw her the next day at the music festival. So I was on tour in France, in the Burgundy region of France. I had figured out she wasn't French, she was actually Spanish. And I'm fine, and we couldn't communicate at all, and I was trying to figure out if she was, married, right? And there was no communication in common at all, and the only word that she could come up with said that she wasn't married is to know that she was divorced. And I thought, well, I'm not down with that. That's not what I was looking for, all right? But it turns out that just meant I don't have a boyfriend. And we just knew each other for a few days, and I came home from France. And I called my parents, and I said, I met the girl I think I'm going to marry. And they're like, yeah, okay, whatever. And we stayed in touch, and I started looking job in my hometown, which is Barcelona. And I found one. You don't just find a job, by the way, in orchestras. It's like no job. So there was like something going on up there, like the hands of somebody. And I moved to Barcelona and I took this job, and it took me 2 years to close the deal. But November 6th is our 25th wedding anniversary. So where's the sin against prudence? The sin against prudence would have been to come back and say, I've met a kind of an interesting girl, I've been on a couple of dates. Never see her again, she lives halfway across the world. That would have been wrong, right? So now I run this big organization. I have 230 employees, and a lot of them are really young. A lot of them are in their 20s, and there are a lot of guys in their 20s. And they're all, this is Washington, D.C., where people date for like a decade, right? And these guys go, I don't know, do you love her? Yeah, I really love her, but I don't know what I'm going to say. Here's what you got to do. Go home, put on your favorite music for an hour, then go over to your apartment and get down on one knee and ask her to marry you. That's my advice. Because if you don't, you're being imprudent. And that's a world we need more of. That's a world that I learned from music. So here are the lessons. In conclusion, it doesn't matter if you're writing symphonies, or you're digging ditches, or you're teaching students, or you're the president of a think tank. Work should be sanctified for the glory of God and the service of our fellow men and women. That's my first lesson. I try to live it every day. Pray for me. Suffering isn't fun, but it can be the key to creativity and insight. It should be, if you sanctify that too. Third, be open to new thinking. Be open to new ideas. Because that's one of the secrets to a truly happy life. And four, be prudent. Take a big risk. Now, I'm almost done, but there's just one more lesson in closing. You take one thing away from what I've talked about tonight, is to reject the idea that there's some difference between truth and beauty. These things that are up here right now, this is truth. I got it from beauty. When you separate out truth and beauty, you miss the best lessons in life, don't we? You know, the whole idea that God would make truth and beauty different things is absurd on its face. So to make that point one more time, I want to finish up where I started. I want to go back to Bach. I want to go back to his 147th cantata. And why is this important? Because you may not have heard of the 147th cantata, but you're going